The boss's fiancée tilted her wine glass toward the waitress whose swollen belly hid beneath an oversized service vest, and let a sentence slip out in Italian, soft as velvet. Do you suppose she even knows who the father is? The table laughed. The boss didn't. He only added one bored remark of his own, also in Italian, that the help were hired precisely so they wouldn't hear anything. The waitress set her tray down, slowly. She corrected the mangled Sicilian dialect he'd just used, then repeated word for word the Spanish sentence his fiancée had spoken to the banquet manager half an hour earlier, the one the woman was certain no one in that room could understand. Finally, she looked the boss straight in the eye and delivered a Ukrainian proverb about a wolf in a tailored suit. 300 people went silent. The man who controlled every loading dock along that river stood frozen, unable to move an inch, while the woman he had just written off as deaf folded her apron in half, laid it on the edge of the table, and walked out. What no one in that room knew, not even him, was that she was carrying an envelope bearing his own name, one that had arrived after her husband's funeral last winter. That night, the Rinaldi empire began to crack, not because of a bullet, because of a woman carrying a tray. If this story moved you, leave a comment, hit like, share it with someone you thought of, and subscribe to our channel for the stories still to come. 3 floors below ground, where the hot steam pipes ran the length of the ceiling and gurgled like a hungry stomach. The employee locker room at the Kingsbury Hotel smelled of industrial soap, mixed with the damp scent of fabric that hadn't yet had time to dry. Marin Kovac sat on the worn wooden bench, bent forward, and that was the hardest movement she would make all day. She had to lean to one side, brace one hand against her thigh, and only then could she reach her shoes. Her belly wouldn't allow her to do it any other way. Those black leather shoes had stayed with her through 3 wrestlings. The shoe repairman on the corner of Halsted, an old Polish man with hands blackened by oil, had looked at her for a long time the last time she'd brought them in, and told her he wouldn't take them again. Not because he didn't want to, but because the leather on top could no longer hold the stitching. She remembered laughing and saying she'd worry about next time when it came. Next time, it turned out, was tonight. She took a piece of foam from her bag, cut from an old cushion, and tucked it into the right heel, where the leather had worn so thin that she could feel every groove in the concrete floor beneath her foot. Then she sat upright, let out a slow breath, and waited for the ache in her lower back to ease. Tonight's shift was a large banquet, 300 guests, the grand ballroom on the 2nd floor. The banquet department had brought in extra workers from 2 different staffing agencies, and that meant no one would remember anyone's face, no one would ask questions, and no one would notice just how much more slowly the woman in the blazer 2 sizes too large was moving than everyone else. Marin had learned that this was a good thing. Invisibility, when a person had no other choice, could become a kind of shelter. The phone in her blazer pocket vibrated. She knew who it was before she even looked at the screen. Denise Kovac never called. She only sent messages, and she wrote them like someone who believed that words put in writing carried more weight than words spoken aloud. The insurance people called back. They've settled on the final amount. Sign it, and I'll give you your share. So stop acting so proud. You think you've still got time? Marin read the whole message twice, then turned off the screen. She didn't reply. She hadn't replied since last winter, and Denise had never stopped sending messages. There was something about the way she used the words, your share, that always sent a chill down Marin's spine. Because in Denise's mind, Adam's death was an asset, and Marin was merely holding it for her. She stood up, slowly, both hands supporting her lower back, exactly the way her mother used to do years ago when she rose from her chair after 10 hours at the sewing machine. Hanging from the hook against the wall was her coat. A thick, gray wool sweater coat faded at the elbows. In the right pocket was an envelope. It had been there through the winter and all through the spring, following her through 7 different shifts and 3 moves from one place to another, and not once had she taken it out. The envelope had already been opened, its edges softened and worn from being folded and unfolded too many times. In the upper left corner was a line of embossed lettering, clean and expensive, bearing only one name, Rinaldi Freight and Cold Storage. Inside were 3 pages describing a workplace accident, contractor fault, a goodwill payment, and at the very end, a signature she had looked at so many times that she could have drawn it with her eyes closed. She didn't take it out. She only lifted a hand and touched the fabric over the outside of the coat pocket once, very quickly, the way someone might touch a scar just to make certain it was still there. A knock sounded at the door, 3 short taps, and the banquet manager's voice called through that they had 5 minutes before everyone needed to be upstairs. Marin loosened the tie in her hair, smoothed back the strands that had escaped along her temples, and twisted it up again, tighter this time, tight enough that the skin of her scalp pulled slightly. She had learned that a loose bun made people look at her longer, and she didn't want anyone looking at her for long. Then she tugged down the front of her blazer, adjusted the fabric so it fell evenly across her body, and stood still for 1 second before the mirror mounted on the metal locker door. The woman in the glass looked back at her with no expression, faint shadows beneath her eyes, and nothing about her suggested that she had once stood in a federal courtroom and sworn that she would interpret faithfully, completely, and without adding or leaving anything out. She turned off the locker room light. Then, she stepped into the hallway and walked toward the stairs leading upstairs, where the sound of string instruments had already begun to drift down through the ceiling. The double doors leading into the service corridor swung shut behind her, and with them, every sound from the ballroom was cut away, leaving only the string music seeping through the walls like voices talking in the room next door. That was when Marin's legs began to tremble. Not from fear, or at least not only from fear. It was more like what happened to the body after a fever broke, when everything was already over, and only then did the muscles remember how tightly they had been braced. She made it 4 steps before she had to put a hand on the side of a stainless steel cart parked against the wall. The metal was cold beneath her palm. She stood there with her head slightly bowed, and heard the beat of her own pulse pounding in her neck. She had walked this corridor more times than she could count over the past 3 months. A long tiled passage with white ceramic walls, fluorescent lights, the smell of dishwashing liquid, and the heat drifting from the kitchen at the far end. There were no pictures on the walls, no carpet, nothing decorative at all, because this was not a place meant for anyone to see. Footsteps came quickly behind her, sharp and irritated. The banquet manager, a gray-haired man named Doyle, whom she had never once seen smile, stopped her in the middle of the corridor. He didn't shout. He lowered his voice, and somehow that was worse. He asked whether she had any idea what she'd just done. He said the event organizers had signed contracts with that family for 3 years in a row. He said no one in this business would dare hire her after tonight. Marin didn't argue. She looked directly at the space between his eyes, just above the bridge of his nose, and held her gaze there until he was finished. Then Doyle told her to remove her employee badge and hand it over right there. There was no need to finish the shift. No need to go downstairs and sign out. She lifted the lanyard over her head, careful not to disturb her bun, and placed the badge in his palm. It was so light that he had to close his fingers around it to keep it from falling. He said something else about that week's wages, about needing to review them. But Marin had already turned away. She walked the length of the corridor, through the kitchen doors, past the dishwashing station where steam billowed white into the air, and pushed open the steel door at the very end. The air outside struck her face like a hand. Snow was falling, the last snow of the season, wet and heavy, melting the moment it touched the concrete loading area behind the hotel. She stood beneath the overhanging metal awning between 2 large dumpsters, and only then, only when no one could see her, did she allow herself to breathe. Her breath came out in one long white plume, then another. She brought both hands to her belly, not to hide it, but from a reflex that had become habit since winter. And she stood that way for a long while, until her shoulders finally stopped shaking. Her gray wool coat was still hanging downstairs in the basement, and the envelope was still in its pocket. She would have to go back for it, but not yet. Inside the ballroom, everything had already begun moving again. The strings continued playing, conversations resumed, and another server had already stepped into the place left empty beside the abandoned wine tray. Normal life returned with a cruelty that was almost effortless, like water closing over a stone after it sank. Only one spot in that room remained completely still. Cassian Rinaldi was standing exactly where he had been before, one hand still holding a glass of wine he hadn't touched, his eyes fixed on the edge of the table covered in white linen. There, between the crystal glasses and a tall vase of flowers, lay a black cloth apron folded in half, its edges aligned neatly and smooth, placed with care like something being returned rather than something thrown away. Bianca said something close to his ear. He didn't hear her. A guest approached and tried to make conversation, said 2 things about the weather, then instinctively stepped back when Cassian gave no answer. Cassian set down his wineglass. He reached for the apron and picked it up. The fabric was still slightly damp at one corner, perhaps where melted ice had soaked into it. He didn't hold it the way someone held a piece of cloth. He held it the way someone might hold a letter that had just been placed in his hands, without yet knowing what was written inside. Wes Halloran stood half a step behind him, silent, waiting. Cassian didn't turn his head. He spoke in a low, calm voice, each word distinct. "Find me that woman's name." By noon the next day, the video had already made its way around the entire city. Someone seated about 13 feet from the banquet table had raised a phone before it happened, perhaps intending only to film the chandelier, and had captured the final 2 minutes and 30 seconds in full. The picture quality was poor, and the sound was tangled with the music of the string ensemble, but no one needed to see clearly. They only needed to hear a woman's voice speaking 3 languages, and then see Cassie and Rinaldi standing perfectly still. The video never reached the newspapers. It didn't need to. It moved through text messages, through phone calls between men who had known each other for 30 years, through the back rooms of restaurants on the west side, where people still ate lunch at hours when the rest of the city was working. In his world, there was one thing outsiders didn't understand. Being humiliated was survivable. Everyone was humiliated sooner or later. What couldn't be forgiven was allowing yourself to be humiliated and doing nothing about it, because that silence would be read as a single sentence. This man has no teeth left. Cassian understood that better than anyone, because he had sat in rooms where those exact words had been spoken about other men, and afterward those men had stopped appearing. Roland Vance came to the office in the early afternoon, earlier than usual. He entered with the same slight lean to the left that hadn't changed in all these years, his cane striking the wooden floor twice before stopping, and he lowered himself into the chair across from the desk as though it belonged to him, because in truth, it did. He said the situation could be handled. He said he'd already had people asking questions. The Kingsbury Hotel had 42 employees working the evening shift that night, and the man who had recorded the video was a young legal assistant seated at table 11, the kind of man who would trade almost anything for enough money to pay off his student loans. He said 3 days and the video would disappear from every device, 1 week, and no one would mention it again. Then he added that he'd been doing this since before Cassian had learned to read, and there was no pride in his voice when he said it, only the gentle weariness of a man who had cleaned up too many things for too many people. Cassian listened without interrupting. Then he said no. Vance looked up. Cassian said to let it spread. He said when a man swings his fist, everyone in the room knows exactly where he's hurting, but when a man sits still, no one knows anything, and it is the not knowing that keeps people awake at night. He said if he spent money silencing 42 people over 2 minutes and 30 seconds, then, by Monday morning, the entire city would understand that those 2 minutes and 30 seconds were worth precisely whatever amount he'd paid. Vance studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and there was something close to pride in that nod. He said, "You learn faster than your father ever did." He had never said that before. Then he bent down, pulled a thick cardboard records box with a removable lid from beside the chair, and set it on the desk with both hands, carefully, as though he were placing something fragile there. Inside was an old external hard drive, its black plastic casing scratched and worn, and beneath it were 3 hardbound dispatch ledgers, with yellowed page edges and handwritten labels. He said this was everything he'd managed to gather over the past 6 months. He said he'd had 3 people try to listen to it. 2 gave up after a single session. The third lasted 3 days before returning it, and saying that it wasn't one language at all, but 4 languages tangled together with dockside slang, and there wasn't a dictionary anywhere in the world that could contain it. He said he didn't understand why they spoke that way, but he knew one thing for certain. People only made themselves difficult to understand when they had something to hide. Cassian opened the box, looked inside, then closed it again. Vance stood, bracing one hand on the desk to push himself upright, and before turning away, he placed his hand on Cassian's shoulder and gave it 2 gentle pats, the kind of touch from a man who had once carried him out of a place bitterly cold before he'd even had the chance to grow up. He said, "You keep looking. I'll handle the rest." He had just reached the door when Wes entered and placed a printed sheet of paper on the desk. On it was a name, an address on the 3rd floor of a building without an elevator, and 3 lines of background information. Sworn federal court interpreter. 4 languages. License suspended. Not yet reinstated. Current occupation. Banquet server by the shift. Cassian read it twice. Out in the hallway, the sound of Vance's cane stopped for a single beat, then continued, and his hand tightened around the spine of the leather notebook tucked beneath his arm. The staircase to the 3rd floor had 19 steps divided into 2 flights, with a green painted iron handrail whose paint had peeled away in places, and at the landing halfway up there was always the smell of someone's cooking made with oil that had been used too many times. The knock came in the middle of the morning. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, neither hurried nor slow. It wasn't the knock of a neighbor coming over to borrow something, and it wasn't the hesitant knock of a delivery man. It was the knock of a man who had never had to stand waiting very long outside anyone's door. Marin was sitting at the table, sewing the strap back onto the cloth bag she had prepared for the day she went into labor. She set the needle down, rose slowly, and opened the door. Cassian Rinaldi filled almost the entire doorway. He wasn't wearing a long overcoat, only a dark gray sweater beneath his coat, and the melted snow on his shoulders had soaked into two darker patches. The smell of wet wool and something dry and woody, clean and expensive, entered before he did, cutting through the damp, stale odor that had lived in this room longer than she had. He didn't ask whether he could come in. He stepped across the threshold and stood in the middle of the room, and somehow the room became smaller. His eyes moved slowly around it, openly, without pretending not to look. The spreading water stain shaped like a map on the ceiling above the kitchen corner. The aluminum pot sitting beneath it, already holding a thin layer of water. The tape running along the crack in the window frame. And on the windowsill, arranged in one straight row, 17 dictionaries with worn spines, some of them wrapped again in adhesive paper. He looked at all of it. He didn't say a single word about any of those things. Not a sigh, not one pitying frown. And it was precisely that silence that made Maren feel exposed. She went back to her chair and sat down. She didn't invite him to sit. He said she was going to work for him. She said she didn't take work from a man after hearing what she had heard him say in a banquet room. He said good, because he wasn't looking for someone agreeable. He placed a sheet of paper folded in half on the table and said the number was inside. Maren didn't open it. She asked what he needed translated. He said a pile of recordings and 3 dispatch ledgers, mixed languages, dockside slang, and 3 people had already given up. She asked why he didn't give it to his lawyers. He said because he wasn't sure who his lawyers were working for. The sentence dropped into the middle of the room and stayed there. Maren looked at him, and for the first time she saw something in this man's eyes she hadn't expected. Not arrogance, but the weariness of someone who hadn't dared to sleep deeply in a very long time. She asked, "Why me?" He said, "Because you hate me." She waited. He said, "Someone who likes me will translate what I want to hear. Someone afraid of me will translate what they think I want to hear. But you'll tell me the warehouse is burning while still handing me the fire extinguisher. And that is exactly the person I need." Maren stayed silent long enough for him to think she was going to refuse. Then she said, "All right, but on my terms." He raised one eyebrow. She said, "First, I don't work in your house, and I don't work anywhere with someone standing over my shoulder. I need a private room with a door I can lock myself from the inside. Second, half in advance, cashier's check, no cash. Third, and listen carefully to this one, if there is something in those recordings you don't want to hear, I will still read it out to you, and you will still pay me in full." Cassian looked at her for a long time. People didn't set conditions for him. No one had done that in years, and he discovered that the first reaction in his chest wasn't irritation. He said a car would come for her tomorrow morning. Then he went to the door, paused for a moment, and added that the building on his side of town was tall and cold, so she should dress warmly. Maren said, "I'm used to the cold." The door closed. She sat still and listened to his footsteps descend all 19 steps, heard the downstairs door slam shut, and only when the sound of the engine began to fade did she open the folded sheet of paper. The number written there was larger than everything she had earned during the last 3 years she had still been allowed to stand in a courtroom. She looked at it, and the strange thing was that she felt nothing at all. She pulled open the desk drawer, took out the envelope whose edges had been worn soft, and placed it beside the other sheet of paper. The 2 pieces of paper lay next to each other on the wooden tabletop, both carrying the same embossed name in the upper left corner. She didn't need his money. She needed a way inside the company that had sent that envelope to her door after her husband's funeral, and until this morning, she hadn't known there was any way to open that door. The office on the 7th floor of the Rinaldi Freight Building overlooked a bend in the river where the water never froze completely because tugboats passed through all winter long. The walls were paneled in dark wood, the floor was covered in thick carpeting that swallowed every footstep, and a ceiling vent breathed out a dry kind of warmth that could make a person sleepy if they sat there long enough. Maren walked in before the sky had fully brightened, and the first thing she noticed was the long table set against the window, cleared completely, with a desk lamp, a water pitcher, a stack of blank paper, and a box of pens. The second thing she noticed was the chair. It wasn't the kind of chair people usually put in rooms like this. It had a high back, thick cushioning at the lower spine, and beneath the table, positioned close to the chair legs, there was a leather-covered footrest. Both were new. No one was in the room when she entered, and no note had been left behind. Maren stood looking at them for several seconds. Then she set down her bag, pulled out the chair, and sat. She didn't say anything. Cassian arrived about an hour later carrying the thick cardboard box, set it on the table, and said nothing either. He took the armchair at the far end of the room, opened another file, put on a pair of thin, framed glasses she had never seen him wear around outsiders, and began working on his own things. That morning passed in a strange kind of silence. It wasn't like the silence in the rented room on the 3rd floor, where 2 women avoided each other by refusing to speak. Nor was it the hostile silence of their previous meeting, the kind with sharp edges. It was the silence of 2 machines placed in the same room, turning in the same direction, each knowing that if one stopped, the other would become meaningless. Maren listened. She listened through an old pair of headphones plugged into the player, a pen in her right hand, her left hand holding the paper flat. For the first 3 hours, she managed to write nothing but scattered symbols. The voices on the recordings overlapped. There was the sound of engines running in the background, and sometimes wind struck the microphone in a long, low roar that swallowed entire sentences. The speakers changed languages in the middle of a thought without warning, sometimes in the middle of a clause, and what they were saying didn't exist in any of the dictionaries lined up on the windowsill at her apartment. Near noon, she began to see it. Not hear it. See it. Certain words appeared far too often for their literal meanings to make sense. No one could possibly discuss salmon that much in a shipping operation dealing in coal and steel, and no one asked how many days dry ice would still be usable in the tone an ordinary person used when talking about freight. She turned back through the dispatch ledgers, traced the dates, compared one side against the other, and everything began fitting together like 2 halves of a hinge. She removed the headphones. She said the cargo in these recordings isn't cargo. Cassian looked up. She said salmon means cash. Every time they use the word salmon, there is a cash payment underneath it, and the number of crates is the amount. She said dry ice isn't dry ice. Dry ice means people. When they say this load has 12 packages of dry ice, they mean 12 human beings. Cassian took off his glasses. He didn't say anything, but his entire posture had changed. Both elbows rested on his knees, his body leaning slightly forward. Maren turned another page, ran her finger down one line, then stopped. She said there's another phrase. It appears 7 times, and not once is it followed by a quantity. Not once is it followed by a delivery date. She repeated it exactly as it was spoken on the recording, then translated it. Cold chain break, she said in refrigerated shipping. A cold chain break is what happens when the system fails and the entire load is ruined. But that isn't how they're using it here. Here, they use it as something that has to be done. Here, a cold chain break is something people do to one another. Outside the window, a tugboat moved against the current, and the water behind its stern was black as oil. No one in the room said anything for a long while. Then Cassian stood, walked to the water pitcher, poured a glass, and set it on the left edge of the table, where she could reach it without having to turn her body. 3 days later, on an afternoon when the sky beyond the windows turned the color of lead long before evening, Maren took off the headphones and left them resting on the table. She didn't call for him. She simply sat there, both hands laid flat over the page, until Cassian realized that the sound of her pen had stopped a long time ago. He asked what was wrong. She said, I understood it wrong. She said, all these past few days, I thought they were talking about taking your freight, cutting your routes, stealing your clients, hijacking your shipments. They aren't. They don't want your freight. She turned the stack of papers around and read each passage to him one by one, slowly, adding nothing and leaving nothing out, exactly as she had sworn to do years ago, in a room with a flag hanging behind the judge. The phrase cold chain break appeared for the first time in a short passage, together with the name of a location. The second time, it appeared beside the words this weekend. The third time, someone asked whether there would be many people inside at that hour, and the other man answered that the more crowded it was, the longer people would be afraid to go in. Maren said they're planning to cause a cold chain break at the Ashland warehouse during the night shift this weekend, and they've chosen the busiest shift on purpose, because that will create more confusion and slow everything down. She said, according to the dispatch ledger, the weekend night shift at Ashland has 40 people. Cassian shot up from his chair. He took 3 steps toward the edge of the table and stopped. And the first question that came out of his mouth wasn't the question Maren had prepared an answer for. He didn't ask how much freight would be inside that night. He didn't ask how much the loss would be. He asked who was working that shift. Maren looked down at the ledger, but she didn't need to search. She said the weekend night shift supervisor at Ashland is Alma Reyes. Cassian stood perfectly still. Then he turned, walked to the window, and stayed there looking down at the river for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had changed. It was lower, and the smooth rhythm he normally used with other people was gone. He said, do you know where that warehouse is? She said, I do. He said it's at the end of a dead-end road, with a scrapyard behind it, and any vehicle trying to get in Has to make 3 turns before it reaches the entrance. He said my father put me on the night shift in that very warehouse when I was barely old enough to know what I was doing, and people said it was so I would learn the business. He said I worked there through an entire winter. He didn't tell her anything more about that winter. He only said the one thing I learned there, and the one thing I still remember, is a loader slipping on an iced-over floor, and the entire night shift standing there waiting for an ambulance, and that waiting lasted so long that people had enough time to forget they were supposed to be hoping. He said ambulances never get there fast enough. Never. Then he said I had the access road repaired, installed more lights, signed a contract with a private medical service, and I thought that was enough. Marin looked at his back. She set down her pen. She said, I know that warehouse too. Cassian turned around. He asked why. The room was very quiet then. The ceiling vent was still breathing out its dry warmth. The desk lamp still cast a yellow glow across the papers, and outside, a tugboat gave one long blast of its horn before falling silent. Marin said, because my husband died there. Cassian didn't move. His entire body stopped in a strange way. Not like a man startled by something, but like a machine that had been running and suddenly had its power cut. He said that warehouse is mine. She said, I know. He said, how long have you known? She said, since the night of the banquet. She said, I've carried an envelope in my coat pocket since last winter, and the name of your company is printed in the upper left corner. She said, I've stared at that name so many times that when someone said your name in the banquet room, I knew who you were before I even looked up. Cassian opened his mouth, then closed it again. He was a man who had sat in rooms where the fate of other people was decided without anyone ever raising their voice, and never once had he found himself unable to find something to say. At last, he asked what was his name. Marin said Adam Kovash. He repeated the name once, very softly, as if testing whether it existed somewhere in his memory. It didn't, and that, more than anything she had just told him, was what made him reach for the edge of the table to steady himself. The next morning, Boyd Merrick asked to see him, and he asked to meet in the lobby, rather than on the 7th floor, a detail Cassian would remember later. Merrick was the director of transportation coordination, a man who had occupied that position longer than Cassian had occupied his own. Broad through the shoulders, hair combed straight back, always wearing coats that cost just a little more than his salary seemed to justify. Enough for people to notice, but not enough for anyone to ask questions. He spoke smoothly. He said the rumors about sabotage at Ashland were fabricated, that the insurance people had heard a whisper and blown it out of proportion, that he had already sent people down there twice to inspect the place, and nothing unusual had been found. He said the real problem was only paperwork, that if they rerouted the shipments through an independent inspection channel where he had connections, everything would come out clean. It would cost only a modest administrative fee, and he could have it handled within the week. Up on the 7th floor, Marin was listening again to recording number 11. 2 men were speaking over the telephone, their voices mixed with the sound of wind. One asked whether things inside had settled down yet. The other answered with a phrase she had passed over 3 times before without stopping because it had sounded like a joke. Il guanto, the glove. The other man said, let the glove sign it. The glove will sign anything as long as the payment is in cash. Marin sat upright. She played it again. Then she opened the dispatch ledger, traced down the approval signature column, and her finger stopped on one box. She stood, didn't even take the time to put away the headphones, and went to the elevator. When she entered the lobby, Merrick was halfway through a sentence about vessel schedules. He turned, looked her up and down, saw a visibly pregnant woman with ink still staining her fingers, and immediately turned away again, continuing the sentence he had been speaking, because in his mind, there was no category in which to place a woman like her. Marin didn't look at him. She looked at Cassian, and she said one sentence in the dialect from the recording, neither quickly nor loudly, each word separated and clear. The glove will sign anything, as long as the payment is in cash. Merrick didn't understand the whole sentence. He didn't need to. He only needed to recognize the first 2 words, and his right hand jerked behind his back before his mind had time to command it, hiding the back of the hand where a pale pink burn scar spread across the skin, the scar he habitually concealed by keeping that hand inside his coat pocket. The entire lobby went silent. Cassian didn't shout. He didn't step forward. He turned to Wes and said, bring me this week's Ashland night shift payroll ledger. Wes brought it down within 4 minutes. Cassian opened it, laid it on the stone table in the middle of the lobby, turned it sideways so the overhead light fell across the page, and began to read. He read aloud, clearly, one name at a time, pausing for exactly the same length of time between each one. Alma Reyes, Dwight Foster, Marisol Aguirre, Kenny Boyle. He kept reading. No one in the lobby moved. The receptionist behind the desk had taken her hands away from the keyboard. By the 9th name, Merrick's face had begun to change color. By the 10th, he lifted a hand to loosen his collar. Cassian read the 11th name, a man with a long Polish surname, and Merrick broke. He said, "All right." He said, "I took the money, but all I did was approve paperwork. I didn't know what they were planning to do inside. I swear." He gave them the contact, an intermediary in the South Docks, explained how the money was transferred, and even told them the week the order had been scheduled. Then he looked up, his eyes red, and blurted out the sentence that would follow Cassian through many nights afterward. He said, "I was only the glove. A glove has to have a hand inside it." Cassian asked who the hand was. Merrick said, "I don't know. I've never met them. The orders came through 3 layers of people, different ones every time, and no one ever said a name." Cassian looked at him for a long time. Then he closed the payroll ledger. Wes asked quietly, "What do we do now?" Cassian answered in a voice so low that anyone standing 2 steps away had to strain to hear him. "Let him go home. Tell him to live normally." Wes went pale. He didn't ask again. Merrick did go home. He went home, sat in his kitchen the entire night without turning on a light. And by morning he drove himself to the federal building on Dearborn Avenue, walked inside, and said he wanted to give a statement on the condition that he receive protection. They took him in. They recorded his testimony for 3 days. And by the end of the 3rd day, they understood that he knew nothing at all. Not one name, not one face, not one meeting. He was only an empty glove. But that testimony was enough for a new case file to be opened under the name Rinaldi Freight and Cold Storage. And from that morning forward, a clock began running that Cassian had never heard ticking. The invitation arrived at the end of that week, not by phone, not by message, but on a card left at the reception desk, bearing only the address of an old restaurant in Bridgeport, and a handwritten line saying that everyone would be there. Cassian knew what it meant. In this world, people didn't hold meetings. They sat down together. And they only sat down together when someone needed to be reminded of where he stood. The room was behind the kitchen, windowless, its walls covered in wine-colored wallpaper that had faded toward brown, with an old ceiling fan turning slowly overhead even though the weather outside was still cold. There was a round table, a white tablecloth, and nothing on it except 5 glasses of water and an ashtray no one used. 5 men were already seated when he walked in. The youngest among them was nearly 20 years older than he was. The oldest sat opposite the door, both hands folded one over the other on the tabletop, and he was the one who spoke first. He said family matters belonged inside the family, but once the whole city had seen them, they were no longer family matters. He said 300 people in that banquet room had eyes, and every one of those 300 went home and told the story in his own way. He said the marriage into the Sartori family wasn't a matter between 2 young people. It was part of an agreement that had been placed on the table before Cassian's father was laid to rest, and an agreement couldn't be left empty for long, because whenever there was an empty place, someone would always move in to claim it. The man seated to his right added that the river routes belonged to no one man alone, that docks required permits, permits required signatures, and men who signed papers could be persuaded. That sentence was spoken in the calmest voice heard all evening. Then they gave him the number. 1 month. Marry within 1 month, or the Sartori family would pull out. And once the Sartoris pulled out, 4 docks downstream would change hands within a season. Cassian listened to all of it. He interrupted no one. He offered no explanation for what had happened in the banquet room, said nothing about the video, and never mentioned Bianca. He sat straight, both hands resting on his thighs, and looked at each man in turn, long enough for every one of them to know that he had been seen. When the last man finished speaking, Cassian reached inside his coat and took out a thin file, held together by a steel clip, then placed it on the white tablecloth. He didn't open it. He simply pushed it slowly across the table until it stopped in front of the man seated on the left. The man looked down. There was nothing on the cover but a surname, his own surname, followed by a given name everyone at the table knew belonged to his youngest son. No one spoke. The man didn't reach for the file. He didn't push it back either. Cassian said that debt is larger than what you're discussing here. He said it has been larger since 2 seasons ago, and the man holding it isn't from this city. He said, "I know because I bought it last month, not to use it, but to keep it from ending up in someone else's hands." Then he stood. He fastened one button of his coat, looked around the table one final time, and said, "I'll give you 1 month to reconsider who is sitting in which chair." He said it no louder than his normal speaking voice. Then he turned his back and walked out, leaving before anyone else, even before the oldest man in the room, something custom said no one was permitted to do. The door closed behind him. Inside, The old ceiling fan kept turning slowly, and for a while no one said anything more. One by one, the men stood and left, each separated from the next by a measured pause, in exactly the order tradition prescribed. Roland Vance was the last one left sitting. He didn't rise immediately. He remained there for a while longer in the now empty room, both hands resting on the leather notebook, his eyes fixed on the place where the thin file still lay untouched on the white tablecloth. That recording was near the end, inside an unlabeled folder wedged between two call recordings she had listened to the week before, and marked as containing nothing. Marin opened it late in the afternoon, after Cassian had gone downstairs to meet with the insurance people, and the room held nothing but the sound of the ceiling vent. The audio quality was completely different from the others. There were no engines, no wind. This was an enclosed room, carpeted, with the sound of a glass being set down on a wooden surface. Someone was talking about maintenance costs in an anxious voice, mentioning the refrigeration system, saying operations would have to stop for several days before the repairs could be done. Then a second voice cut in. Marin's hand stopped. She didn't need to hear the rest of the sentence. She had been sitting in the same room with that voice for 2 weeks. She had heard it read 40 names aloud in a large lobby. She had heard it say that ambulances never arrived fast enough in that part of the city. Cassian said the warehouse could take care of itself. Cassian said, "Don't touch it. Leave it exactly as it is. And if anyone asks, tell them we're waiting for an estimate." Cassian said, "I'm not spending money on a place we're going to have to deal with anyway." Marin took the headphones off and set them on the table, then picked them up again and put them back on. She listened from the beginning. Then again, she opened the file properties and looked at the recording date. It was from last winter. It was during the same period when, according to the calendar hanging in the kitchen of her rented third-floor apartment, Adam had been working rotating shifts and coming home while it was still dark outside. There is something that happens inside the human body when the ground gives way beneath your feet, and it isn't the way books describe it. There is no scream. There are no tears, at least not immediately. There is only a coldness that travels from the back of the neck down into both hands, and a strange calm as sharp as glass, the same calm she had felt once before, on the morning the hospital called her. She sat completely still for about 2 minutes. Then she did what had to be done, in order, without trembling. She disconnected the hard drive from the computer, plugged in a small memory card she always kept inside the pen box, copied that folder along with the 3 folders around it, checked everything once to make certain, then removed the card and slipped it into the inside pocket of her gray wool coat, in the same compartment as the envelope. She reconnected the hard drive exactly where it had been. She straightened the papers on the table, put the cap back on her pen, and pushed the high-backed chair neatly against the edge of the table, just as she did every afternoon. She stood looking at it for 1 second, then she left. Outside, darkness had already fallen and snow was coming down again. The late spring snow of the lake country, wet and heavy, melting against the street into a layer of gray water. She didn't call for a car. The company car was still parked downstairs, and the driver was still sitting inside waiting as he did every day. But she walked past without looking at it, and continued toward the elevated train station at the end of the street. She walked slowly. She had to walk slowly. Water seeped through the stitching of the shoes that had already been resoled 3 times, and soaked into her socks, and she felt every single step clearly, and she thought that perhaps this would be the last time she ever walked this street. On the train, she sat in the last row of seats facing the window, and heard nothing at all. She only watched the city drift beneath her, windows glowing with light, rooftops covered in a thin layer of snow. And she thought about how for 2 weeks she had sat less than 6 steps away from that man, had drunk from the glass of water he poured for her, had sat in the chair he had ordered placed in the room, and had even spent one afternoon thinking that perhaps she had been wrong about him. By the time she reached the Federal Building on Dearborn Avenue, public hours were already over, but the doors were still open, and the hallway on the 9th floor was still lit. They told her to sit and wait, that someone would come out to speak with her. The plastic seats fixed to the wall were cold, and the bulletin board across from them was covered edge to edge with notices. Marin sat down, placed both hands over her belly, and waited. Then she took out her headphones, plugged them into her phone, and played the recording for the 4th time. Not to check it. She had already checked it 3 times. She played it again only because there is something in the human heart that keeps wanting to press a finger into the place that hurts, just to make certain the pain is real. The 4th time, she heard it. Not the words. She already knew the words by heart. She heard what lay beneath them, the thin layer no one ever noticed, what people in the profession called background noise, that faint hum every room in the world produces, And no two rooms ever produce in quite the same way. Between the two words "take care," the background changed. It changed only for the blink of an eye. A slight rise and then a slight drop, like someone had opened a door, a crack, and closed it again. Maren rewound, listened again. It was still there. She moved forward to the next sentence, the one about the estimate, and at the beginning of that sentence there was a gap, a space of absolute silence, so clean that it felt unnatural. People didn't speak that way. People breathed between sentences. Heavy breathers could be heard clearly. Light breathers forced you to listen closely, but everyone breathed. Here, one breath was missing, not covered over, removed. She sat upright on the row of plastic chairs fixed to the wall, and suddenly the entire city beyond the 9th floor hallway windows seemed very far away. She listened again from the beginning, but this time she didn't listen to the meaning. She listened only to the joins. There were three different pieces, 3 different rooms, 3 different moments in one man's life, trimmed at both ends and stitched together into a sentence he had never spoken. The voice was real. Every word belonged to him, but the order didn't. There was an irony in that which Maren needed a moment before she was willing to face. Years earlier, during a federal trial, someone had handed her a recording to interpret on the spot. She had made it halfway through before stopping and telling the judge that the recording had been altered, that there were 3 places where the background noise didn't match, that the speaker in the second segment wasn't standing in the same place as the speaker in the first. They asked what evidence she had. She said, "I can hear it." They asked who else besides her could hear it. No one. The court's technical staff examined the recording and said there was nothing unusual. The prosecution said she had exceeded the role of an interpreter. The opposing attorney said she was biased. 3 weeks later, her professional license was suspended pending investigation. And that investigation dragged on for 14 months before quietly disappearing without a conclusion, without anyone being disciplined, without anyone apologizing. She simply stopped being called. She lost her apartment, lost her insurance, lost the habit of standing when the court clerk called the room to order, and in the end she put on a blazer 2 sizes too large and carried trays through rooms where people paid to have someone around who heard nothing. She had paid with an entire life for hearing a cut in a recording. And now, sitting on a plastic bench outside the prosecutor's office with a memory card in her coat pocket and a door about to open, she realized there might be only one person left in the world with an ear good enough to hear the second cut. And that person was sitting here, preparing to hand that cut over as if it were the truth. A door opened at the far end of the hallway. A young woman carrying a file folder stepped out, looked around, and asked who had come to give a statement. Maren stood. She said, "I'm sorry, I have the wrong office." She went to the elevator, and she moved faster than she had moved in months. She was alone inside the elevator. She stood watching the numbers descend on the illuminated panel, and in her mind a new question began opening, slowly, sending a colder and colder sensation from the back of her neck downward. To build a sentence like that, a person didn't need to be clever. A person needed material. Dozens, hundreds of hours of the same man's voice, recorded in different rooms over different years, enough to pick out separate words one by one and rearrange them however someone wanted. Not every enemy had that. An enemy might secretly record a few phone calls. This was different. This could only have come from someone who had sat in rooms with him for years, close enough that no one ever bothered to ask why he was always there. Alma Reyes called her the next morning. Maren had never met her, and knew only the name from the dispatch ledger. But Alma said she had asked for Maren's number 3 months earlier, and had kept it ever since, unable to bring herself to call. She said, "Don't misunderstand me. I don't need anything from you." She only said there was still a locker at the Union Hall on Ashland that no one had cleared out, and notices had been sent 3 times, and she had signed for all 3 because no one else was willing to. Maren was silent on the phone for quite a while. Then she said, "Please give me the address." The Union Hall was a low, 2-story brick building with a faded painted sign and a flagpole out front. Inside, the corridor was covered in army green vinyl flooring, the walls lined with group photographs of workers from one training class after another through the years, and at the far end was a locker room with 2 rows of gray metal lockers as tall as a person, each one numbered in white. Alma Reyes was already waiting there. She was small, with hair that had gone almost completely silver and was tied neatly at the nape of her neck, wearing a heavy work jacket, her hands still dusty from cardboard. She handed Maren a small key with a paper tag tied to it, pointed toward the row on the left, and said Locker 61. Then she stepped back and stood in the doorway, both hands tucked into her coat pockets, and said nothing more. Maren walked over. She stood in front of the locker for a while. A strip of masking tape had been stuck to the gray-painted door, and on it was his name, written in marker, in the handwriting of someone from Human Resources rather than his own. She inserted the key. The lock gave a dry click. The door opened slowly, and the inside was dark, and there was a smell. That was the first thing that touched her. Not the sight. The smell. The smell of protective work clothes, of cold metal, of the cheap soap he had always used, and beneath all of it, his own particular scent, the one she had stopped smelling on the pillow since last winter. She stood motionless, one hand still holding the locker door. His protective coveralls hung from a hook, the creases still intact, the sleeves slightly wrinkled at the elbows. His leather gloves were tucked into the breast pocket. On the top shelf sat a jar of instant coffee more than half used, its lid not fully tightened, a white ceramic mug with a brown stain at the bottom, a roll of yellow electrical tape, a ballpoint pen wedged into the seam of the door, and in the deepest corner, standing upright and leaning against the side of the locker, was an envelope. Maren reached in and took it out. A plain white envelope, already sealed, with a stamp fixed in the corner. In the center, written in the slanted, slightly untidy handwriting she recognized at once, was her name. No address, only her name. She stared at the stamp for a long time. He had put a stamp on it. He had meant to send it through the mail to a woman who lived in the same home with him. She sat down on the wooden bench between the 2 rows of lockers. She had to sit. She opened the envelope slowly with her thumb, trying not to tear it. Inside were 2 things. The first was a small rectangular piece of glossy paper printed in black and white, with perforated edges, an ultrasound photograph. In the upper left corner were the date, the clinic name, and a string of numbers. In the center, inside the fan-shaped field of light, was a tiny form that anyone who had ever seen one would recognize immediately, even without knowing how to read it. Maren didn't understand. She had never given him one. She never had. The second thing was a piece of paper torn from his work notebook, the perforated edge still intact along the left side. He had written in ballpoint pen, the letters leaning, in places pressed so hard that the pen had nearly torn through the paper. I already know. On Tuesday I grabbed your coat by mistake, and the appointment slip fell out. I went to the clinic and asked, and they let me have a picture. I've been pretending I don't know so you can tell me yourself, because I know you're waiting for the right moment. You're always waiting for the right moment. Just tell me. I'll pretend to be surprised really well. I've been practicing. Beneath that, at the bottom of the page, there was another line written smaller. I'll leave this in the locker until you tell me. Then I'll show it to you, and we'll laugh together. Maren made no sound. She sat on the wooden bench between the 2 rows of metal lockers, holding the 2 pieces of paper in both hands, and her shoulders began to shake, then her whole body, and she bent forward, folding herself around her belly as if she were shielding it from something, and tears fell onto the backs of her hands, onto the edge of the photograph, and she hurriedly wiped the photograph, before she wiped her own face. All through last winter and all through this spring, there had been one sentence she had never said aloud to anyone, not even to herself, and that sentence was that he left before he ever got the chance to know. In the doorway, Alma Reyes was still standing there with both hands in her coat pockets, her eyes lowered toward the army green vinyl floor. She didn't step inside. She didn't say anything. The notebook was lying at the bottom of the locker beneath the boots, a black plastic-covered kind the union handed out to workers at the beginning of each year. Its corners curled, and the elastic band stretched loose. Maren found it while clearing out the last of his things, and she opened it only because she wanted to see more of his handwriting. The first half of the notebook was ordinary work: equipment numbers, maintenance dates, names of people who had signed for things, short lines written quickly while standing. From about the middle onward, it was different. The writing became smaller, denser, and underlined. He had made a list. The left column held the identification numbers of the safety valves in the refrigeration area. The middle column showed the inspection dates printed on the tags attached to the equipment. The right column showed the inspection dates recorded in the official files. On 4 lines, the 2 columns didn't match. Underneath, he had written one sentence and underlined it twice. Someone is signing approvals without coming up here. In the pages that followed, he had begun copying down the identification numbers of shipments passing through the cold storage section during the night shift. He recorded the dates, the arrival times, the names of the tugboats. Then he compared them with the manifest posted in the dispatch office, and he circled 6 shipments. Beside those 6 circles, he wrote 3 words: not on manifest. The last page containing writing was a draft of a letter. He had written the opening paragraph 3 times and crossed it out twice. The final version was short, polite, almost awkward. Dear Mr. Rinaldi, I am a contract electrician working at the Ashland warehouse. I have some records concerning safety equipment and several shipments that I think you should know about. I have reported this twice to my direct supervisor and have not received a response. I don't want to make trouble. I am only asking for 5 minutes of your time. I have the paperwork with me. Beneath it was his signature and a date. That date was 11 days before the morning the hospital called Marin. She brought the notebook to the 7th floor that same afternoon. She didn't say anything. She placed it on the table in front of Cassian, already open to the page with the draft letter, and stepped back once. Cassian read it. He read slowly, without touching the paper with his fingers. He finished that page, then turned backward. Read the list of valves. Read the section with the 6 circled shipments. Then he returned to the letter and read it a second time. He set the notebook down, and for a very long while he couldn't say anything. At last he said, I never received this letter. Marin said, I know. He looked up. She said if you had received it, you would have remembered the name. That day in this room, I said his name and you repeated it as though it were a foreign word. Cassian stood, took 2 steps, then stopped in the middle of the room. Something was opening inside his mind, and it wasn't opening like bad news. It was opening like a room someone had walked through thousands of times, only to turn on the light one day and discover that the floorboards had been rotting for years. He said, in my entire life, I have never ordered anyone to do anything to a worker. He said, and I always thought that was enough. He said I built a house where everything that reached my desk had already been filtered 3 times. And I called that good management. And I paid very high salaries to the people who did the filtering. He said anyone who wanted to see me had to go through the schedule. The schedule went through an assistant. The assistant asked an advisor. And by the time anything reached my hands, it had become 2 lines in a summary. He said I liked it that way. He said because that way I could sleep at night. He turned back to look at her, and his eyes were red. He said I didn't kill your husband, but he stood in the lobby of this building with papers in his hands, and I was on the 7th floor. And between him and me there were only 7 floors and a system I built myself. Then, he walked to the filing cabinet in the corner of the room, opened the bottom drawer, and took out a thin report bound with a plastic spine. The cover bore the name Ashland Warehouse, and 1 line beneath it, Workplace Incident Report, Internal Conclusion. He had approved the payment the previous winter without reading beyond the summary page. He turned to the final page, where the preparer's signature appeared. Then he stood completely still. The handwriting was familiar, slanting slightly to the left, the first letter larger than the rest, exactly the same hand he had seen on thousands of documents over decades, going all the way back to the first papers on which someone had taught him how to sign his own name. Bianca Sartori chose a small cafe in the Gold Coast, the kind with 4 tables and a barista who knew the names of the regulars. And she arrived first, sitting with her back to the door. She didn't take off her sunglasses when Marin walked in. She said, I'm not here to apologize. She said, if that's what you're waiting for, you can leave now. Marin pulled out the chair and sat down slowly, both hands supporting her lower back, and she said, I'm not waiting for anything. Bianca looked at her belly for about 2 seconds, then looked away. She said, people think I hate you because of that night. She said, I don't. She said, I've been sitting in dining rooms like that since I was young enough to need a cushion on my chair just to reach the table. And I learned very early that when men talk about 2 families, they're talking about 2 ports. And when they talk about a wedding, they're talking about a signature. She said, my father put me on the table exactly the way he would put down a shipment. Except a shipment doesn't have to wear a dress and smile. She said, I've known my value for a long time. What I can't stand is someone else knowing my value better than I do. Marin didn't ask anything. She let the silence remain where it was. Bianca finally took off her sunglasses, and her eyes weren't red, only tired. She said, I'll tell you one thing, then I'm leaving. Last fall I went home to get my passport. The door to my father's study was partly open, and he was on the phone. He never said the name of the person on the other end. He called him the old man. He said the old man told him to leave things alone, that it wasn't time yet, that the boy wasn't ripe enough. Bianca said, I remember because my father has never called anyone the old man. In my family, everyone has a name. That one person didn't. She stood, wrapped her scarf around herself, and said the last sentence without looking at Marin. I'm not helping you. I just don't want him to win. That night, Marin reached the 3rd floor close to 10 o'clock. The door was still locked. The bolt hadn't been forced. The frame hadn't been pried, and there were no wet footprints in the hallway except her own. She opened the door, turned on the light, and understood immediately. Not with her eyes exactly, but with something beneath sight. The windowsill. Of the 17 dictionaries, 16 were still there, and all 16 had been rearranged in a different order. Their spines facing outward, straight, and even, graduated neatly by height, more carefully arranged than she ever kept them herself. The 17th was gone. The Ukrainian dictionary with the blue cloth cover, its spine peeling away, with her mother's name written in purple ink on the inside page. Marin stood motionless in the middle of the room. Then she turned her head toward the wooden table. Directly in the center, perfectly straight, both edges parallel with the edge of the table, lay a plastic identification card yellowed with age. The photograph showed a younger woman, her hair tied neatly back, looking straight ahead. Beneath the photograph were her name, identification number, and the words Sworn Interpreter, Federal Court, Northern District of Illinois. That card had been confiscated the same day her license was suspended. It was supposed to be sitting inside some records box in the building on Dearborn Avenue. There was no note, no writing, none was needed. She understood the message as clearly as if someone had spoken it beside her ear. We know who you used to be, and we know how easy it is to erase someone like you. The next morning, everything happened very quickly and very quietly. By mid-morning, 2 Sartori docks downstream had their operating permits suspended because environmental inspection files were missing signatures. 1 shipment was being held at the port while its bill of lading was verified, and 3 intermediary corporate accounts had been frozen by the bank for compliance review. There wasn't a sound. No one came knocking on anyone's door. Everything was legal. Everything had paperwork behind it. And everything happened before lunch. Marin stood in the doorway, still holding a glass of water, watching that man sit there and sign one document after another. Expressionless, neither hurried nor slow, like someone answering correspondence. And for the first time since the night of the banquet, she was afraid of him, not because he was vicious. She was afraid because he didn't need to be. Roland Vance stood beside the desk, leaning on his cane, reading each page over Cassian's shoulder. He said, "Good." Then he said, "But this will only hurt Sartori. It won't bring him down, and men in pain tend to do reckless things." He said, "If it were me, I'd hit 1 level lower, hit somewhere that forces him to borrow from outsiders." Cassian stopped his pen, thought for a moment, then pulled the next sheet closer. Cassian said he would send people in. He said he had 4 men who could do it without leaving a trace, and he would send all 4 in at once. Marin asked what they were looking for. He said a letter. She asked how many pages the letter was, what kind of paper it was written on, how many folds it had, whether there was an envelope, whether the ink was blue or black. He couldn't answer a single question. She said in a records room holding decades of paperwork, 10 people could search for 3 days and still not finish, and even if they held the letter in their hands, they would put it back down, because to them it would be nothing more than 1 sheet among tens of thousands. She said, "I'm different. I've looked at that handwriting for 8 years. I could recognize it from 3 feet away, face down, if I could see only the first 2 words." Cassian said no. She said, "You don't have the right to tell me no," and that ended the argument. The catering company that served the weekly dinner at Roland Vance's house was a small business in Lincoln Park, and they were always short-staffed on Thursday nights. Marin called Tuesday afternoon, said she had experience serving seated dinners, and they hired her immediately without asking another question. She didn't disguise herself. She didn't need to. She wore the same black suit, 2 sizes too large, the same shoes that had been resoled 3 times, twisted her hair into a bun tight enough to pull at her scalp, and entered the house through the service door, passed through the kitchen, took a tray from the chef's hands, and stepped into the dining room. The table seated 12. The chandelier hung low, and among the people sitting there were 4 men whose names she had heard on the recordings. 4 men who could make 1 telephone call and ensure that a woman would never be called for work again. She poured wine for each of them. She stood beside their shoulders, tilted the bottle, waited a full 3 seconds, then turned the neck slightly so the final drop wouldn't fall onto the tablecloth, exactly as she had been taught on her first shift. The first man was halfway through a story and didn't stop speaking. The second pushed his glass toward her with 2 fingers, his eyes still fixed across the table. The third said thank you without turning his head. The fourth said nothing at all. Not one of the 4 looked up at her face. All winter long she had hated that invisibility, that feeling of standing 12 inches away from someone and still not existing. Tonight, it was the only thing keeping her alive. Halfway through dinner, when the kitchen began clearing the main course and the back hallway filled with people moving in both directions, she set her tray on a side table, picked up a stack of clean napkins as an excuse, and went down the stairs to the basement. No one asked where she was going. Wherever a server carrying something went inside a house, People assumed she was simply doing her job. The basement was colder than the floors above, with white painted walls, fluorescent lights, and at the end of the corridor a heavy wooden door that wasn't locked. Behind it was the records room. 4 rows of metal shelving rose to the ceiling, running parallel to one another, packed with file boxes, every box marked with a handwritten label. Maren closed the door behind her and stood still for 1 second while her eyes adjusted to the light. She began with the row marked with the most recent year, pulled out a box, flipped through it, pushed it back, moved to the next. Her fingers skimmed the edges of the papers, and her eyes weren't reading words. Her eyes were searching only for a shape, that particular slant, that heavy pressure on the first letter. At the 9th box, it came over her. It began in her lower back, a slow band of pressure wrapping around toward the front, and it wasn't a sharp pain. It hurt like a large arm closing around her body and gently squeezing. Maren dropped the file, gripped the metal shelf with both hands, and lowered her head. She didn't make a sound. She counted. In. 1, 2, 3, 4. Out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. She counted that way 4 times, eyes closed, forehead resting against the cold metal, thinking only one sentence. Not now, please, baby, not now. The pressure loosened. She straightened, wiped the sweat from her temple with the back of her hand, and reached for the next box. She found it in the 13th box, wedged between 2 unrelated sets of minutes, without an envelope, folded into thirds. She recognized it before she opened it, from only 2 words showing along the edge of one fold. She unfolded it. It was the letter, written cleanly, without corrections, signed at the bottom, and in the upper right corner there was a received date stamped in red ink. It had reached its destination. It had been received, stamped, and carried down here. Maren folded it again, slipped it inside her clothing, and when she looked up, she saw what was on the last row of shelves, the row she hadn't touched yet. They weren't file boxes. They were boxes of tapes and discs, hundreds of them, stacked from floor to ceiling, each one bearing a small label, and on every label was a string of numbers, and a name written in handwriting that slanted slightly to the left, the first letter larger than the rest, stretching back across decades. By the time Maren came all the way up from the basement stairs, the hallway lights had been turned brighter, and Roland Vance was standing there with his cane, facing the door. He wasn't blocking her path. He was simply standing there, like an old man who had happened to step into the hallway for a little air. He said the kitchen route would be shorter for you, but the side door gets less traffic. Maren stopped. He said I had dinner cleared 20 minutes earlier than usual, so it would be quiet downstairs. He said I also told the chef not to send the new server down for ice. Then he looked at her and smiled. A gentle, tired smile. The smile of an old man who had sat too long inside a house that was too large. He said, "How many people do you think carry trays through my house without me knowing their names?" Maren didn't run. She knew running would be pointless, and she also knew he wasn't going to touch her, because if that had been his intention, he wouldn't have cleared a path for her beforehand. She stood straight, both hands hanging at her sides, and she began to speak, slowly, piece by piece, fitting everything together right there in front of him. She said my husband's letter reached its destination. It has a received date stamped on it. That means someone at the reception desk accepted it and sent it upstairs according to procedure. And the only person everything passed through before reaching Mr. Rinaldi's desk was you. Vance didn't deny it. He only shifted his cane from one hand to the other. She said the report on the Ashland warehouse incident concluded that the contractor was at fault. You wrote it. You were also the one who signed off on the equipment inspection records without ever going up there. My husband recorded 4 safety valves where the inspection dates on the tags didn't match the dates in the files, and he reported it twice to his direct supervisor. I don't know who that supervisor reported to, but I do know where the letter has been since last winter. It was under the stairs in your house, in box 13. He remained silent. She said there's another row of shelves down there, tapes and discs stacked from floor to ceiling, each one with a label, and every label is written in your handwriting. People call you the family's memory. I thought that was just a grand way of putting it. It turns out they meant it literally. You've been recording for decades, recording everything, even people who are dead now. Vance said there's nothing wrong with that. He said a family without memory is a blind family. Maren said the problem isn't that you remember. The problem is that you had the material. She said to build a sentence someone never actually spoke, you need hundreds of hours of that person's own voice, recorded in different rooms over many years. There isn't an enemy of Mr. Rinaldi anywhere in the world who could have done that. Only someone who had been sitting in the same rooms with him for his entire life. This time Vance looked up. She said, "And that cardboard box you carried up to the 7th floor that day? The hard drive you set on the desk with both hands? You patted his shoulder and told him to keep looking, that you would handle the rest. You handed it to him yourself, because you were certain no one in the world could decipher it. 3 people had already returned it, and you knew that. There was one thing you didn't account for. You didn't expect the 4th person to be a woman carrying trays." A long silence settled over the hallway. Then Vance let out a breath, and he said in a voice so soft it was almost gentle, "I let you take the letter." He said, "Do you think I didn't know you were down there?" He said, "I wanted it out of my house. I wanted it in your hands." Marin asked why. He said, "Because you would take it back to him, and he would come here himself, alone, onto my ground." He leaned on his cane and took 2 steps toward the window, then added without looking at her, "I held him for the first time less than a month after his mother moved into that house. I taught him how to sign his name. I taught him how to tie a necktie, where to sit at a round table, who to walk behind and who to walk ahead of." He said, "I did all of it, but I did it for the other 3. He said, "I served his father for 40 years, and I served the 3 sons of the first wife from the time they were too young to hold a dinner knife properly, and that seat belonged to them. It had been decided before this boy was ever born." He said, "Then one winter passed, and all 4 of them were laid in the ground. And suddenly it was my turn to stand behind the son of the 2nd woman." He said, "I stayed there. I stayed there for decades, but not for one day did I ever see him as my master." He turned back, and there wasn't a trace of bitterness on his face, and that was what made it frightening. He said, "I'm not destroying this family. I'm correcting something history got wrong." From beyond the hallway came the sound of chairs being pulled back in the dining room, and people were beginning to rise. Cassian came the next morning, alone, exactly as the old man had calculated. He brought no one with him, gave no warning, and entered through the front door. The housekeeper let him in and withdrew to the kitchen, leaving only 2 men in the living room and a cane propped against the side of a chair. Vance was already seated in his usual place near the fireplace. His left leg stretched straight out as always. He said, "Sit down." Cassian didn't sit. He placed something on the low table between them, and Vance looked down, and for one very brief second, his face changed. It was the leather notebook. The notebook he had kept tucked beneath his arm for decades, its corners worn smooth, its strap once broken and repaired with thread. His hand rose instinctively to his chest, to the place where he always kept it, and found nothing there. Cassian said, "I took it last night." Then he opened the notebook, not to the last page, but near the beginning, where the paper had already faded to ivory, and he read one line aloud in an ordinary voice, without emphasis. "The boy is back. Now we'll see what he ruins first." He closed the notebook. He said, "You wrote this 2 weeks before that winter night when you came down to the warehouse and brought me home." He said, "I've remembered that night my entire life. I remember you taking off your coat and putting it around me. I remember you didn't say a word in the car. You just turned the heater all the way up and drove very slowly. I've told that story to 3 people in my whole life." Vance opened his mouth. Cassian raised one hand, not high, only to chest level, and the old man fell silent. Cassian said, "I'm not asking what you sold. I'm not asking how much you took. I'm asking you one thing." He stopped, and when he spoke again, his voice no longer belonged to the head of anything. "You taught me to sign my name. You taught me to tie a necktie. You taught me to read manifests. Taught me to count crates, count tons, count shipments, count money. You taught me how to count cargo. Not once did you teach me how to count people. Did you forget, or did you do it on purpose?" Vance sat there. His mouth remained slightly open. The hand resting on his knee tightened, then relaxed again. He had prepared himself for many things that morning. He had prepared for shouting, for doors being kicked, for hands grabbing him by the collar. And he had even prepared for the possibility that he would never leave that room alive. He hadn't prepared for that question. He sat in silence for a very long time, and at last he managed only one word. "Boy." Then he stopped, and nothing more would come. Cassian stood. He said, "I'm not handing you over to anyone. I'm not calling the police. I'm not calling my people, and no one is coming here." He said, "As of this morning, your name no longer appears on a single company document. No contract, no authorization, no account, no guest list. 3 drivers, 2 housekeepers, and your secretary were reassigned at 7 o'clock. Your car is still there, your house is still yours, and I haven't touched 1 cent of your money." He said, "You get to keep your name. I'm not taking that from you." Then he walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped without turning around and said one final thing. "But from today on, you pour your own coffee." That afternoon, on the 7th floor, Cassian placed a white envelope in front of Marin. He said the full amount, plus the portion we hadn't calculated. He said you've finished the job. Marin looked at the envelope. She didn't take it immediately. She said, what about the team that was paid to cause the cold chain break? He said, I'll handle it. She said, I can finish listening to the last part. There are about 4 hours of recordings no one has touched yet. He said there's no need. She looked up. Something had just closed behind his eyes, and she had seen it before, in the banquet room, on the night he said servers were hired, so they wouldn't hear anything. He said the car will take you home. If you need a reference for another job, tell Wes. Marin stood. She asked, what did I do? He said you didn't do anything. She asked then why. He didn't answer. He already had 3 answers in his mind, and he said none of them, because everyone began with admitting that a file bearing the name of his company had been opened in the building on Dearborn Avenue, and that from this moment forward, anyone standing close to him would have a name inside it. He only said thank you, Kovach. It was the first time he had called her by Adam's last name. Marin picked up the envelope. She said, you know, the worst thing about men like you isn't that you're cruel. It's that you think silence is kinder. Then she walked out without slamming the door. That night, she bought a bus ticket to Milwaukee for Saturday morning, and she began packing her belongings into 2 bags. The memory card was still in the inside pocket of the gray wool coat, in the same compartment as the old envelope, and Marin had intended to leave it there. But on Friday night, after both bags had been packed and set beside the door, she sat on the edge of the bed, plugged in her headphones, and opened the final section, the 4 hours of recordings no one had listened to yet. The first 3 hours contained nothing. Then came a recording made somewhere with a high ceiling, with the sound of shoes against stone and a revolving door turning. A young man's voice, polite, with a slight tremor at the end of each sentence. He said, I don't have an appointment, but I only need 5 minutes with him. He said I brought the paperwork. Marin stopped breathing. The other man answered in a calm, warm voice, the voice of a grandfather. Leave it here with me. Go on home. It's cold outside. I'll send it upstairs. Adam said, thank you, sir. He said, please make sure he gets it. Then the revolving door turned again, and that was all. Marin sat motionless on the edge of the bed for a long time, the headphones still in her ears, both hands resting on her belly, and she played that passage 3 more times only to hear him say, thank you, sir. Those were the last words spoken by Adam Kovach that she would ever hear in her life. Then the recording continued. Immediately after the silence came another segment, recorded somewhere else, with 2 unfamiliar voices. One man said, what if the old man goes down? The other said, then we go ahead anyway. The first asked, who gives the order? The other said, no one needs to give an order anymore. The money has been paid, the schedule is set, and the weekend is the weekend. Marin ripped the headphones from her ears. She stared at the phone in her hand, and tonight was Friday, and the weekend night shift at Ashland began as soon as darkness fully settled over the city. She called. He answered on the second ring. She didn't say hello. She said tonight. The dispatch room at the Ashland warehouse sat on a steel platform about 10 feet above the floor, enclosed on all 4 sides by glass, with a clear view over the entire loading area below. Marin sat there with a pair of headphones and a frequency scanner Wes had brought, a pen in her left hand and an open notebook beneath her right. Cassian and Wes were below, inside the valve section behind the concrete wall separating the freight area from the mechanical systems. Outside, snow was falling heavily, the last wet, weighty snow of the season, and the high yard lights turned it into slanting yellow streaks. At the deepest part of the night, voices began coming through on one of the frequencies. Marin translated immediately, speaking into the radio 1 sentence at a time, adding nothing and leaving nothing out. She said they're at the east fence. She said they're asking whether the dry ice is in yet. She said someone answered, it's all there. Then the frequency died. No static, no crackle, completely dead. Marin scanned again. She moved up, moved down, and caught them on another band much farther away, and the voices had shifted position. She spoke into the radio, faster now but still separating every word clearly. Not the east gate. They changed frequencies. They're by the return line, behind you. Below her came the sound of running footsteps. Marin didn't wait. She reached out and struck the evacuation alarm mounted on the glass wall, and the siren erupted, and every white overhead light in the loading area came on at once. From above, she saw Alma Reyes step into the center of the main aisle, raise both hands, and begin pointing. No one panicked. Forklifts were left where they stood. People removed their gloves. They formed lines and moved toward the rear yard exit, slowly and evenly, exactly as they had practiced. Alma went last, turned back to count everyone once, and only then stepped outside. In the valve section, everything happened very quickly. Metal struck metal. Someone slipped on the wet floor. There was hard breathing, fabric tearing, the sound of a container falling over and rolling a long distance. 3 men and 1 valve handle. Wes stopped one man in the narrow passage. The second reached it first, and Cassian came a moment later. And for the space of 3 breaths, no one knew whose hand would touch it first. Then came the harsh squeal of turning metal. Once, twice, followed by a long hiss. The needle on the gauge dropped again, then stopped at the lowest mark. Finished. Outside in the yard, snow kept falling. 40 people stood in 3 rows beneath the high-pressure lights, their breath rising in white clouds. Some still held water bottles. Some had blankets wrapped around their shoulders from the ambulance that had just arrived. Cassian came out through the side door, his coat torn at one shoulder, his hair wet and flattened by melting snow. And he didn't speak to Wes, didn't call anyone, didn't ask about the freight. He walked to the beginning of the first row and started moving down it. He stopped in front of every person. He asked their name. The first man said Dwight Foster, and Cassian nodded and said thank you, Mr. Foster. The second was a middle-aged woman, and she had to say her name twice because she was trembling. The fourth was a young man who had been working there only 3 weeks, and after giving his name he simply stood there staring, because it had never occurred to him that the man whose photograph hung in the Human Resources office knew he existed. Cassian finished the first row, then moved to the second, then the third. 40 names. On the steel platform behind the glass, Marin stood watching from above, one hand resting on her belly, and she didn't wipe away her tears. Marin came all the way down the iron stairs and stepped out into the yard while he was still halfway through the 3rd row. She meant to go toward Alma. She made it about 10 steps before she stopped. That tightening band returned, and this time it didn't loosen. And at the same moment there was a warm sensation running downward, unfamiliar and impossible to mistake, and her knees went soft beneath her. She sank onto the snow-covered concrete, one hand braced against the ground, the other wrapped around her belly. Someone cried out. Cassian was halfway through saying a name. He turned his head. Then he ran. People at the Ashland warehouse would tell the story for years afterward, that on that night there had been an ambulance parked just outside the gate, its lights still turning, its rear doors still open, and that man had run straight past it without stopping for even a second. Because inside his mind, in that place where the things learned during a long-ago winter had remained and never left, there was only one sentence. Ambulances never arrived fast enough in that part of the city. He took off his coat, wrapped it around her shoulders, slid both arms beneath her, and lifted her. She was lighter than he expected. He said, "Hold on to my neck." He said, "Don't try to say anything." His car was parked near the entrance, and he laid her across the back seat, folded his coat beneath her head, and climbed behind the wheel. Wes ran to the car door. Cassian said, "You stay here. No one leaves this yard until the police arrive." And then he shut the door. The road from the Ashland warehouse to the main street was a dead-end road with 3 turns, and snow had covered the pavement so completely that the lane markings had disappeared. Both his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. He noticed it and gripped harder, and they kept shaking. Then he began to talk. He said, "Don't close your eyes." He said, "I know you're tired, but keep your eyes open and look at the ceiling of the car. There's a scratch up there. Look at that scratch." He said, "The closest hospital is the one on Damon Street. I've driven past it 1,000 times. I even know which traffic light stays red the longest." He said, "Do you know how many people came out of that warehouse tonight?" 40. All 40 of them. I counted twice. He said, "Alma Reyes came out last. She even turned around and counted them one more time. She's better at counting than I am." He talked about one thing after another. About the road. About the high-pressure light that had burned out at the second turn and how he was going to have it replaced. About who needed to be called in the morning. About anything at all as long as there was still sound inside the car. Because every time he stopped speaking, he could hear her breathing in the back seat, and he couldn't bear it. At the red light, he looked into the rearview mirror. Her eyes were still open. She was looking at the scratch on the ceiling. The maternity ward hallway was bright white and smelled of antiseptic, and everything there moved faster than anything he was used to. A stretcher came out. People asked how far along she was. They asked when it had started, and Marin answered every question, her voice breaking but clear, because she was a woman who had spent her entire life making sure she said things correctly. Then a young nurse holding a clipboard turned to him and asked a perfectly ordinary question, one she asked 20 times during every shift. "What are you to the patient?" Cassian Rinaldi stood there, the man who controlled every loading dock along that river. The man who had sat in a windowless room before 5 families without blinking once, stood in the middle of a hospital hallway, with his coat torn at one shoulder and melting snow running down his neck, and he couldn't find a single word. He wasn't her husband. He wasn't a relative. He wasn't a friend. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. From the stretcher, Maren turned her head toward him. She said, her voice hoarse but loud enough to hear, "He's family." The nurse nodded, wrote it down on the form, and they wheeled the stretcher away. He remained standing alone in the middle of the hallway, and he had to reach out and grip the back of a chair. That night lasted a very long time. Near dawn, when the sky outside had begun turning pale gray, he sat on the row of plastic chairs outside the recovery room and saw a middle-aged woman standing on the other side of the glass, holding a paper bag, standing there for who knew how long without pressing the buzzer or asking anyone for help. Denise Kovac stood there with the expression of someone who had traveled the whole distance only to realize at the end that she had no right to step inside. Maren saw her through the glass. She lay still for a while. Then she raised one hand, very slowly, and waved her in. By June, the yard behind the Ashland warehouse was no longer an empty stretch of concrete. They had built a covered rest area there, with long wooden tables, benches, a small refrigerator, and a coffee maker that someone on the night shift forgot to turn off almost every evening. On the brick wall inside, at eye level, 3 small polished bronze plaques had been mounted, with no decoration at all, only a name and one short line beneath it. The plaque in the middle bore the name Adam Kovac. There was no dedication ceremony. They simply mounted it one Tuesday morning, and from that day on, everyone who passed would glance at it, and some would reach out and touch it, and no one had ever told anyone they were supposed to. That afternoon was sunny, the first clear, bright warmth of early summer by the lake, with a cool breeze coming up from the river. Tables were set out in the yard, with cake, lemonade, and a fan plugged into an extension cord running from the break room. Baby Ada was passed from one pair of arms to another all afternoon, and she either slept or opened her eyes to look around before falling asleep again. Completely unconcerned that 40 people had gathered around to admire her, Dwight Foster held her the longest and was teased by everyone for it. The young man, who had been only 3 weeks into the job that winter, was now considered one of the regulars, and he still didn't dare hold her, only stood nearby smiling. Alma Reyes was the last to take the baby. She walked to the end of the table, where there was one chair that for months no one had ever said belonged to anyone, yet no one had ever sat in it. And she laid the baby there on a blanket folded into quarters, then sat beside her with one hand resting gently in support. No one said anything. Then someone poured more lemonade, and the conversation began again. Cassian arrived late, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to Maren without saying what it was. She opened it. The blue cloth-bound dictionary, its spine peeling away, and on the inside page her mother's name was still written in purple ink. She looked at it for quite a while, then asked, "Where did you find it?" He said it took 3 months. Then he cleared his throat and recited the proverb about the wolf in a suit, the entire saying, in Ukrainian, slowly and clearly, and he got the second word wrong, and every word after that. Maren burst out laughing. She laughed aloud, laughed until she had to cover her mouth with one hand, and it was the first real laugh that had come from her since last winter. She said, "I have one condition." He said, "I'm listening." She said, "You are never allowed to speak Ukrainian again." He said, "Agreed." That spring, the case file was made public. Her professional license was restored, and she now headed the company's interpreting and compliance department, working in a room with a door she could lock herself from the inside. Some people spend their entire lives being seen only through the uniform they happen to be wearing. But dignity doesn't live in clothing. It lives in whether a person has the courage to speak the truth at the very moment when truth is the most expensive thing they still possess. And true power has never been the ability to force other people into silence. It is the courage to open your own books, call every person inside them by the right name, and say, "I was wrong, and I will make it right." If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so we can continue listening together to more compelling stories every day. How do you feel about Maren and Cassian's story? And if you had been in her place that night in the banquet room, would you have chosen silence or spoken up? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear what you feel from the deepest part of your heart. We wish you and your family lasting health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.